They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair. Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Hello, and thank you for checking out this educational presentation about political prisoners in the United States, recorded on Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024, and organized by the Louisville Workers Brigade. The Louisville Workers Brigade is a nonprofit association of working people dedicated to educating, supporting, and uniting working class forces in our community. Please check out our website, www.louworkersbrigade.org, and give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. This educational presentation features Louisville activist and organizer Sonja Wilde-de Vries, a true veteran of the left here in Louisville. While Sonja has organized in numerous spaces for Black and women's and queer liberation, for organized labor, and for Palestine, to name just a few, the brigade asked her to speak about political prisoners and the prison industrial complex, given her decades of experience in this field of organizing. To protect the identities of attendees at our event, we have edited this video and removed certain portions while still maintaining the integrity of Sonja's presentation. For those wondering why a workers' association, primarily concerned with organized labor, is interested in political prisoners, the brigade's answer is twofold. Firstly, as a revolutionary organization dedicated to class struggle unionism, we recognize the interconnectedness of the exploitation workers endure and the oppression many marginalized communities face, including political dissidents and revolutionaries. Secondly, we recognize the historical fact that political prisoners have included great labor organizers like Big Bill Haywood of the IWW, Mother Jones, and the Haymarket Martyrs, who were falsely imprisoned and ultimately unjustly executed. As the class struggle intensifies here in the U.S. and abroad, the need for organizing around political prisoners will become more urgent as state repression against the left increases. We hope you enjoy this presentation, and please feel free to reach out to the brigade if we can be of assistance in any way. Solidarity forever.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Sonja Wilde-de Vries, she, they. And I just want to take a moment to be still with everybody, to just, recognize that here we are on stolen land in this time when we're witnessing just such brutality, not just in Palestine, but definitely the genocide in Palestine, and now expanding to Lebanon, the continued brutality against people, all over the world, mostly orchestrated by this government, and also in our country. The police brutality that continues, the brutality against trans and queer people, women, indigenous, BIPOC people, so many. We're the majority, we're the majority. That's the good news. But I just want to take a moment to recognize that this is, I'm very grateful that you asked me to do this, because the issue of political prisoners has to be central to what we do. Some of you may become political prisoners, because if you are challenging the power that is the United States, that's a possibility. And Anne Braden always used to say that at the worst times, that was when the best organizing could happen. That's when you have the most potential for organizing, because if we can look at it in a way of recognizing that people want something different, to me, that's why people don't vote, because we have, what choices are there really? And so it's, It's a brutal time, it's a really hard time, it's a heartbreaking time, but it's also a time of possibility. And that's why I'm glad when I see folks out here organizing and doing good work. So thank you for that. As I said, political prisoners in this country, outside of this country. Now I remember when I was younger, the U.S., our government, used to love to talk about political prisoners everywhere else. We didn't have political prisoners. But China, Russia, Cuba, they're always pointing the finger at other countries having political prisoners. And as a young person, I became aware first of, not to go too far back, but my grandfather was a political prisoner of sorts because he was held by the Nazis for a year and a half as a communist in a concentration camp, and he made a miraculous escape. But I grew up in the Netherlands, and there were a lot of communities in exile, and one of the central issues to those communities was always their political prisoners. Whether it was the Kurdish people or the people from El Salvador or Chile or wherever, a central issue was their political prisoners, because they did not see their political prisoners as being separate. And I think that's something that unfortunately we have done in this country. If you can, the more left progressive movements, I'll back up a little. So I first got involved with prison issues when I was working with the Kentucky Alliance. This was back in the 80s. And working with Ann Braden, and it was the issue of Imani Harris and Ben Chavis. Anybody ever hear them? Yeah? Yeah, well, they had both been activists, active in Black liberation, civil rights, and I don't remember all the details, but we were working to get them free. And that's where my connection with prison issues started. And then, I moved to Boston, and at the time, in the 80s in this country, there were a lot of underground movements, armed underground movements. Weather Underground was pretty much busted by then, but there were a lot of other ones. The Black Liberation Army was still active, American Indian Movement, the Mexican National Liberation Movement, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, and they all had armed wings that operated in this country, which was terribly controversial for most of the left. And my position has always been, it doesn't matter if you don't support their strategies. They are part of our movement. Mm-hmm. These are people who sacrificed everything to fight for justice. And these are mostly the people who ended up in prison with long prison sentences are mostly people who, I would say all people who fought for a long time on the outside, who fought against racism, who fought against police abuse, who fought the Vietnam War, who fought for LGBTQ rights. They're not people who just woke up one day and said, I think I'll go underground and start, fighting with weapons. Just want to take a moment to say I was not one of those people. No, I was telling Aiden before this, it's kind of funny. I was being interviewed by somebody once recently, and afterwards, a couple months later, she's like, do you want to see what I wrote? And at first I was like, nah, it's okay. And then I thought, I should probably look. And she had written Sonja Wilde-de Vries, who was a member of the armed underground. I was like, no, I wasn't. It was a little bit alarming, and I was very glad that I checked her work. Anyway, so, but to give you an idea, and please, if you have questions while I'm talking, I do want this to be more of a discussion. And I told Benjamin that I would talk more just from an experience level, because I'm going to give you all some resources at the end, for just facts and who's left, who the political prisoners are that we're still trying to free. That that is something that is, there's some great resources and definitely, does anybody here write to any political prisoners? No. Something to think about. We still have quite a few, a couple dozen. Does anybody here write to any prisoners? Okay. I mean, that's the other thing too, and do they write back? Not yet. Yeah, you have to be pretty consistent. But the other thing is just the whole concept of who is a political prisoner. In a country that uses prisons not just for profit, but for control and to hide our social problems. Angela Davis said prisons, what is it? Prisons don't disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. And that's exactly what it is. Poverty, racism, houselessness. I mean, look at the bill they just passed here in Kentucky, totally criminalizing houseless people. So in a way, those are also political prisoners. They are people who are imprisoned a lot of times as consequences of the brutality and the unjustness and the lack of treatment for addiction, for mental illness, so many things. And so I always feel a little bit funny making the distinction, but for the purpose of tonight, when I say political prisoners, I mean people who either are in prison because they deliberately did something against the law for political reasons, like bombing the Capitol building or something, or people who are political activists who get framed on bogus charges, which also happens a lot, which is why I always tell people, like, if you're gonna get arrested, make sure it's intentional. Like, don't drive without your license. Don't give them something to get you with. Because as activists, they will get you if they can. And they will be very happy about it if they can criminalize you. So, I don't know what's coming in the next few years. None of us do. But we've had a steady march toward the right and toward more repression. Just to give an example of what we got away with back in the 80s. So I was telling you that, there are a lot of armed underground groups, right? So when they would take an action, and most of them were extremely careful about not harming human beings, but when they would take an action, they would send out what they called their communiques, that they did it, why they did it. They would send them to the press that generally would ignore them, but they would send them to organizations, and people would then, give them out. And this was not illegal at the time. When I imagine doing that now, I think you would not see the light of day ever again, right? Okay, so the other thing, that I think is really important along with the issue of political prisoners and prisons in general, is just recognizing, and I'm sure everybody in this room recognizes this, that the system is not broken, that it's working exactly as it was intended to work. How many prisoners how many incarcerated people do we now have? 2 million?
Around 2 million.
Yeah. Yeah, and that huge jump in incarcerated people happened at a time when crime was actually going down, and it really has nothing to do with crime. But anyway, so let's see, I've got so many notes up here. Yeah, so, and along with political prisoners that have always existed in this country too, although the more oppressed that you were, the less likely you were to become a political prisoner, they would just shoot you. Just like the Nazis did, like they generally shot the organizers because they didn't want them to continue to organize in the camps. But we don't learn about that in school. We don't learn about all of the miners who were killed trying to organize unions, the labor strikes, of course, the way policing started, with killing, catching ernslave people. And then, just the massacres of labor strikes. Who learned about any of that in school? Anybody? No. It's crazy, right? I mean, it's just mind-blowing. And working in a school, I cannot believe the way history is still being taught. That's why we need more good teachers in there. But seriously, and all of that is very intentional. We don't know our history. It's really important to know our history. And to create a different vision of what we want. Now, I can tell you back in the 80s, the left was not about supporting any of the political prisoners. It was very sad. We were seen, those of us who did support them were seen as extremists and kind of like, oof, stay away from me. They were okay with armed struggle in El Salvador or Honduras or Guatemala, but Puerto Rico, no. Or in the United States, no way. Black Liberation Army, are you kidding? And I just remember what a difficult struggle it was. And, we would argue, like, you don't have to support their actions, but they're part of our movement and they're getting abused, they're getting mistreated, they're not getting represented. And that's the other reason I was excited about this, because, I do think we're going to need more of that in the coming years. And so to remember that, we don't have to totally agree with their list of, reasons or what they did. But if they're part of the larger progressive movement, we have to be there for them. And that's, I had someone, in my family actually, who was kind of, also on the left, but very much in a different sphere in terms of that. But I remember going to court together, and after watching these, this was anybody ever heard of the Ohio 7? Yeah, really? Okay, cool. What was interesting about them is that they were a group of white working class people. A lot of the weathermen were middle class students, And the Ohio 7 were a working class group that had been doing anti-apartheid, anti-police abuse, and they were starting to get targeted by the police. And around that time, it was late 70s, early 80s, they went underground. And one of their groups they formed was the United Freedom Front. And they did work in conjunction, they were in solidarity with the Black Liberation Army, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, AIM, all those groups. I actually was part of their defense committee because I was in Boston when they got arrested. And it was really interesting. And actually, Richard Williams, I don't know if you remember his name, but we became very dear friends for the rest of his life. He died in prison, sadly. And he was my children's godfather. But he wanted to make very clear to me, we were not having an adventure. We were really serious about what we were doing, and we were really serious about not hurting people. And so they would literally sit outside a place that was, that they were going to hit for months to make sure they knew exactly when the janitors left, when the building was empty. And I think that's really important because sadly the weather underground wasn't quite as careful. And I think they learned from that, especially with the people working in those buildings who had nothing to do with the policies. But I just, I used to bring my son to visit him, and he was afraid my son would think it was a romantic idea. So he was like, listen, I'm gonna tell you how boring it was. We sat there for months. But yeah, because you have an image. I don't even remember what image I had. I just knew that, here were these people who had really risked everything and were getting beaten up in the court, stun gunned, just devastated right in front of our eyes. It was pretty intense. They'd have like a row of riot cops facing us in the courtroom, and then another row attacking them if they decided that was what they were going to do that day. So, yeah. Whew. We're definitely taught, even in the progressive movement, to see those people as kind of like they've gone beyond. They're a little extreme, and most of them now say, well, this was a mistake, that was a mistake. But again, it's like we have to stand by them. And Leonard Peltier is still in prison. I'm sure everybody knows who he is. He's 80 years old now. He's been in for over 40 years. Mumia, Abu Jamal, also getting up there. And the movement was able to get him off of death row. So, that's the other thing I wanted to say, is that activism around political prisoners does work. In fact, I've seen it work more than I've seen it work around a lot of other issues. When I was living in California, and this also is a reflection of how much things have changed in the prisons. I was visiting someone in FCI Pleasanton, federal prison in Pleasanton, Dilcia Pagan, who was a Puerto Rican independence fighter. And at the time she had like an 80-year sentence. And I remember visiting her, and one day she said, "Oh, I'm getting out soon." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Yeah, I had a dream that I was getting out." And lo and behold, a couple years later, she got out. She was like, "Yeah, my grandmother told me this was going to happen." It was pretty amazing. But that was the work of activists, totally just non-stop demanding that these Puerto Rican independence people be freed, that some of the other prisoners also got clemency. I was not a fan of Clinton, still not a fan of any Clinton, but he did give clemency to 18 Puerto Rican political prisoners and POWs, and also to Susan Rosenberg and Laura Whitehorn. Laura Whitehorn got out after 14 years. Linda Evans. And that was an amazing thing, to actually see political prisoners leave prison. Was one of the most memorable things I've ever experienced, for sure. And when, I don't know, did anybody see Out, the documentary? I know you did. You did, okay. Yeah, when we started making that documentary, it was about Laura Whitehorn, who was a political prisoner who was convicted of bombing the Capitol building in response to U.S. intervention in Central America, and also some other actions against the Police Benevolent Society, what a misnomer, after they killed Eleanor Bumpers, a black grandma who was being evicted. But we made a film about her, and we did not know she was getting released. She didn't know she was getting released when we started it. So that was completely amazing. And also, we went into the prison to make a documentary film. Like, that is not something, I think it was a year after we did that they passed a law in the BOP that only established press can come into the prisons. So none of us independent filmmakers. So things have just gotten, tighter and tighter. And like, I look back and I can't even believe some of the things that we could do then that, like, now you would not see the light of day if you did, And it's been slowly, sometimes a little more dramatically, like after September 11th. I almost said 7-Eleven. Oh my God. It's terrible. I watched that video too many times. Terrible. But yeah, and I think, it's continuing that way, because we see with the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd uprising, that people are still fighting their charges. You know, people got felonies, mostly black folks got felonies, and the white people with them got misdemeanors. But people are still fighting their charges. People who are doing environmental actions are getting much longer sentences. And this is just something we have to really stay close to and be aware of. And, you know, since we're talking about that, like, I really recommend that you all write to political prisoners. Because to hear about stuff that's going on outside, especially from younger people, especially the political prisoners who have been there for decades, when they hear from young folks who are out in the community doing good work, it is so uplifting and so important to keep that connection so there's not such a divide between inside outside. Yeah.
So for those interested in doing something like that, is it best to go through an established organization that deals with this, or just look the political prisoner up and write to them directly?
There is, I happen to bring this, a website, the Jericho Movement. Anybody heard of the Jericho Movement? I figured you would have. Yeah, that has all of the names of the political prisoners, their addresses, all their information. The one thing I would say is it will take a while for them to write back to you. So just keep writing, because what happens is so many people, well, at different times, so many people have written to political prisoners and then never written again, or, you know, they write back and then the person doesn't write back. So it's really important to keep that contact, like make it a commitment. And even if they don't write back to you, I can say that your letter will have a lot of meaning. I mean, I visited Richard for 25 years. And he said it was hearing from the outside that really kept him going, that kept him from getting into despair, that, you know, in his last, like, he had cancer, and in his last couple weeks, like, there was this flurry of letters and cards from people all over the world, and he just, like, it meant so much to him. And, you know, it's like, you have to think, like, people like Leonard Peltier, he's probably never gonna get out. I mean, I hate to say that, but, you know, every time he has parole or anything, the FBI shows up in force and says, he killed some of our people, and, you know. So, yeah. But yeah, and I think education around the issue of repression and, you know, things like workshops on, like, don't talk to the FBI, don't, you know, those kind of things. We need to be doing more of that now. We really do, because people, I mean, I myself have slipped in some pretty bad security lapses over the years. You know, it happens. And it's not that we need to be paranoid. I think we just need to be aware and careful, and conscious and intentional about what we're doing, you know, to protect each other. You know, I love Nahanda Iboyadun. You know who she is, who she was. Sadly, she died of cancer in Cuba. But she was very passionate about, you know, how important it is for us to support political prisoners, she said, because if we don't support political prisoners, people are going to be afraid to struggle. You know, and I know that's true because I meet people all the time who are like, oh, I really, you know, I agree with you. I want to be out there, but I'm really afraid. It's like, they know what they're doing. You know, the intimidation tactics do work to a certain degree. And so we need to make sure people know that if something happens to them, we will be there. You know, it's like in 2020, during the uprising, you know I felt so much less concerned about getting arrested because we had the most amazing jail support that I had ever seen, honestly. there's someone in the room who was part of that. Like that makes all the difference. No one was going to be lost in the system. No one was not going to be met outside the jail when they got out. No one was just going to be left there, because that is the worst feeling. And we need to keep that going. It's not just for times of crisis, you know. We've got to have these things in place. So, yeah, I have all these great quotes, but, oh, you know this one. I'm going to read this one because we can get really bogged down, rightfully, in how hard it is. But we also have to be creating an alternative, you know? We have to create community. And Assata Shakur has always been so clear and so strong about that. She says, part of being a revolutionary is creating a vision that is more humane, that is more fun too, more loving. It is really working to create something beautiful. And, you know, Assata is still living in Cuba, free, although in a much more guarded way now that they put a big bounty on her head, and now that she's in the top 10 international list of, you know, wanted people. But, you know, and the way that she, her story, the way that she was able to escape is such a beautiful story of solidarity and out. I can't think of the word, but anyway, she was freed by black men, and then they transferred her to a van with white women driving, and they just didn't know, you know, the prison was looking, the police were looking, they couldn't imagine that, you know, there would be, and it was mostly queer women, I must say. But she got free, and she got all the way to Cuba, and thank God for Cuba, because there were so many people living there in exile. You know, some of them have since passed, but Cuba was always taking people, and it's like they have put $1 million bounty out for her, and no one has turned her in there. And I just, you know, whatever you think about Cuba, that one thing, it's like, I still get chills when I think about it, you know, because she does beautiful work. She still writes, she's an artist. She used to meet with people all the time until that bounty, because really the most likely person who would turn her in would be someone coming from the US posing as a solidarity activist, right? So that can't happen anymore. But, okay, so who knows about the MOVE bombing? Yeah, I was living in Boston at the time. 11 people were killed that day, 5 of them children. And you know, sadly again, there was not a lot of reaction from the progressive movement. You know, they were nationalists from my understanding, you know, very, very different ideology, philosophy. But yeah, I think a combination of racism and just not really understanding, like there was not much of an uproar. And I mean, they bombed them, you know. Ramona Africa survived, and she's, yeah, Ramona, I think Ramona is still active. I'm not sure. Yeah, they were and are very dynamic activists and worked tirelessly for Mumia's freedom, because Mumia Abu Jamal was covering, he was in Philadelphia, so he was covering what happened with MOVE, he was covering the police brutality, he was covering all of these things as a journalist, and then he was framed, and he's still in prison. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's like, he's been in prison longer than most of you have been alive, I think. Probably. Except for you in the back. I'm just kidding. But yeah, you know, and I think, I was thinking too of like, you know, most of, it's like the Palestinian political prisoners, thousands of them, right? You know, and it's all part of the same thing. you know, it's also important for us to support the Palestinian political prisoners. Because it's all part of the design of this system. What's happening in Gaza, you know, is, I think, because Western Europe, the UK, the United States are afraid their power is slipping, and they are trying to, you know, grab more of it, more resources, more land. You know, I get very frustrated when people act like Israel is doing this, like, against the US, like, oh, the US doesn't want Israel doing this. It's like, no, it's the other way around. I mean, it's like, they're our bully in a way, you know? The US doesn't care about Jewish people at all, never has. So it's got nothing to do with that. It has to do with, you know, the West having like this proxy in the Middle East. Anyway, that's kind of a side note, but not really, because it's all so deeply connected. Yeah, and so, you know, I think just more of this kind of education is so important. You know, it's like, who knows about Sacco and Vanzetti? Come on, Walter.
What about Sacco?
Briefly, yeah, briefly.
Well, they want to intimidate the immigrant community, and they framed these two guys on the Iranicus. They framed them on a bank robbery charge, where a guard was killed. Big movement. Developed the freedom. You know, a lot of people cut their teeth in that movement. You know, William L. Patterson being one of them. He's linked to the Panthers and Angels case, and they eventually were executed. Yeah. And the judge famously told a friend of his, "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards today?" When he sentenced them to die. You know, I mean, it's on the record. It's not. It's not made up, and
right.
And nothing could save them. But there was a worldwide movement. You know,
Also, something we don't learn about in our history classes.
Good song. Charlie King has a good song about it.
Yeah. And of course, the Rosenbergs, who were executed in 55. 53, also lefties. So yeah, I mean, it's always going on. You know, a lot of people know about COINTELPRO, because that was very specific, very blatant. Of course, you know, mainly leveled at the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, AIM. But it's not like it's gone. I mean, COINTELPRO maybe doesn't exist, but this, you know, the same things are going on, the same information gathering. And now, I mean, you know, they don't have to work very hard. They don't have to work very hard. You know, they're like, hey, guys. But you know, it's just, I think we have to be aware of it without getting paranoid. You know, which is sometimes hard, and to remember that we do have power, you know, that we can organize, that we can get them to drop charges like they have done with many of the people in the uprising of 2020. We can get them to give clemency. We can give them to, you know, let people out of prison. I remember when we organized to get people out of the jails during COVID, and it worked, you know. So I think that's the antidote to despair, is to remember that we do have power if we organize, if we stand together. You know, and I mean, it is a tough time, but yeah. Some of the other people, let's see. So yeah, so go to Jericho. That's the best organization to look at to see the list of who's remaining in prison, the political prisoners. Back in the 80s, it was like over 100 people. That was true until a little, like 2000 and something. And then a lot of people were released. But a lot of people have died in prison. You know, like I was telling you, Richard Williams, his sentence, he was one of the Ohio 7. His sentence was 155 years. And he was in segregation. When September 11th happened, they put him in segregation for 3 straight years. I'm just gonna, oh, you know what? I was gonna read a couple poems from political prisoners. That's what I meant to do. Sada. Who's read this? All right, everybody needs to read this.
So good.
Yeah, so good, so good. I've read it many times. And yeah. So this is her poem, Affirmation. And I think she wrote it once she was in Cuba. I believe in living. I believe in the spectrum of beta days and gamma people. I believe in sunshine, in windmills and waterfalls, tricycles and rocking chairs. And I believe that seeds grow into sprouts and sprouts grow into trees. I believe in the magic of the hands and the wisdom of the eyes. I believe in rain and tears and in the blood of infinity. I believe in life. And I have seen the death parade march through the torso of the earth, sculpting mud bodies in its path. I have seen the destruction of daylight and seen bloodthirsty maggots prayed to and saluted. I have seen the kind become the blind and the blind become the bind in one easy lesson. I have walked on cut glass. I have eaten crow and blunder bread and breathed the stench of indifference. I have been locked by the lawless, handcuffed by the haters, gagged by the greedy. And if I know anything at all, it's that a wall is just a wall and nothing more. It can be broken down. I believe in living. I believe in birth. I believe in the sweat of love and in the fire of truth. And I believe that a lost ship steered by tired, seasick sailors can still be guided home to port. And I would say a lot of us are feeling like seasick sailors. Yeah, and then who's heard of the Lexington Control Unit? Did you all know about the Lexington Control Unit? It's not there officially anymore, but horrendous sensory deprivation. They put some female political prisoners in there. Susan Rosenberg, I can't remember who all was in there, but it was 4 or 5 of them. Total sensory deprivation, bright walls. They modeled it after West Germany. West Germany, you know, had a lot of political prisoners as well. Baader-Meinhof and other people, and you know, a lot of them mysteriously committed suicide. But partly because of these intense conditions, you know, not being allowed out of the cells, not hearing anything, not seeing anything, not having any contact with other human beings. It was a bit of an experiment. And now they have that within other prisons. Like, we fought to shut it down, it got shut down, but they have similar things in other prisons, like within the prison. Who knows about Marilyn Buck? you have. This is great. You should do like a workshop with everybody else. Anyway, Marilyn Buck was a political prisoner as well. And the first time she was imprisoned, it was for buying a box of bullets for the Black Panthers. And she got a year for every bullet.
Oh, yes.
And she escaped. Then she got locked up again. They say she was involved in Asada's liberation. And sadly, she did not get out until a few weeks before her death. She had cancer, so she finally got compassionate release, but they waited much too long. But she wrote this beautiful book of poems, which I highly recommend. You know, back then, imprisoned people were able to organize. Like, they organized all kinds of things, prisoner organizations. It's not allowed anymore. When I first went to visit people out at FCI Pleasanton, you could actually bring them food and clothing. And it's just all like become so constricted, especially political. I mean, any kind of organizing amongst imprisoned people is not allowed at all.
Federal or state prison?
This was federal. Yeah. Moon bereft. Beyond razor-wired walls, The moon shimmers in the late summer sky, spills over in pale brightness to draw me into its fullness, washing my eyes in quicksilver. Now, in a heavy-lidded cell, moon-bereft nights leave me weeping. Tears well up in dry, cratered wounds. Despair arises, dark and irradiated, to swallow starlight and spit it out like steel needles that incite my loneliness. My soul careens off cell walls, wails till pain tires, and the pale moon of memory appears to call me home. Yeah, they never stopped organizing. They did an art show for Mumia that was all across the prisons. Everywhere people were making art to sell for Mumia's freedom, to get Mumia off of death row. They did organizing around HIV and AIDS, and oftentimes it was led by some of the political prisoners in the prisons. I know Maryland, did literacy classes, and they stayed so engaged. And I remember as a young person, being so starstruck and thinking, having no clue what it really meant to be a political prisoner, and being so just blown away when I would meet these people, and they were so vibrantly engaged and active, in the prisons, and also active in writing for, papers outside of the prisons, and that's still true. There's a really great thing called prison radio. Y'all heard of prison radio? Yeah, and they do they're not interviews. Anybody who's incarcerated can call them and talk for 3 minutes, and they just put that on the air. It's a great way of getting incarcerated people's voices out there. It's such a beautiful program, and it's it was started by two people who were very much involved in trying to get Mumia off of death row, and they're still going strong. And it's just, that's the thing that has always blown me away is Laura Whitehorn, for instance, who's who we made the documentary about. She's in her 80s, and she's still organizing to free political prisoners and to free, there's a group called RAP, Release Aging Prisoners. Just incredible work. And so, I guess I'll end this presentation by just saying, what I said in the beginning, it's they're part of our movement. The prison system wants us to see people who are incarcerated as other, not having anything to do with us. And if you don't have loved ones in there, it's very easy to not know anything about it. I've been amazed at how little people know, because my partner is in prison, how little people know about what happens in prisons. And we have to be part of making sure that political prisoners know they're not forgotten, and that anybody incarcerated knows they're not forgotten. They're a part of our community. So anyway, that's all I got. So if people want to comment or questions. I think it's about us getting out there with people we don't normally talk to. I think one of the most powerful ways to do that is, two ways. One is asking if you can come to somebody's church or community group or other kind of group to talk about it, but also door knocking, canvassing. That is it's one of my, I hate it, but it's one of my favorite things to do in terms of it's a very powerful way to talk to people you wouldn't normally talk to. Yeah. Do you have other ideas or?
No, I just wanted to get your insight on some particular strategies.
Yeah. I think we have to get outside of our comfort zones. And some of the old school ways are still some of the best ways. Knocking on people's doors and going to where people are instead of saying, hey, come to our event. No, most people aren't going to do that. You got to say, can I come? And where what we're involved in. If you're involved in a I don't know, it could be a group that talks about books, you know, can I come talk about this? You know, doing that, like, you know, organizing where you are is I think the most powerful way. Because, you know, a lot of people are unhappy with what's happening, but they don't know how to get involved, or they're afraid, but if we talk to them, you know, definitely not social media. Like, social media is a great tool, but it's not really an organizing tool. You know, it's for people who already are organized. And it's also for, you know, all of our Homeland Security and FBI and everybody. Right? Yeah, and I want to put a plug in for Vocal Kentucky, because they are doing this work, and they are awesome. You all know about Vocal Kentucky? They do work around houselessness, mass incarceration, addiction issues, harm reduction, and it's all led by people with experience, and it's powerful, powerful work. They're down on Brook Street. It's a great group to support and go to their events. Please do, right? I mean, do you know how cool it would be to send a letter to Leonard Peltier and say, I'm in Kentucky and I know about you and I still hope you get free and here's what I'm doing. You know, of course, you also have to be careful because, of course, they use it as gathering information, the prisons, you know, use our letters, our phone calls, but they're gathering information, you know, every which way. But it's just something to be conscious of. But it's not, you know, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because people need to hear from, especially young folks. Okay. Thank you all again for inviting me. Appreciate it. Now we're going to be social.
Yes.
This union maid was wise to the tricks of company spies. She couldn't be fooled by a company stool. She'd always organize the guys. She'd always get her way. When she struck for better pay, she'd show her card to the National Guard, and this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union.